He's sweet, honestly. Just rough around the edges, you know. The kind of man who can build you a skyscraper and still hold his fork wrong at dinner. But God, his money doesn't hold anything wrong. His money is flawless. The words came through the walls soft and unhurried. Vanessa Sinclair's laugh trailing after them like smoke, and Nathaniel Calloway went completely still in his own kitchen, a soup ladle suspended halfway between the pot and the bowl, steam curling up past his knuckles and dissolving into nothing. He did not breathe for a moment. He was not entirely sure his heart was beating either. Welcome to our YouTube channel. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch today's video. Before we begin, we would love to know where you are watching this video from. What time is it where you are right now, and which country are you joining us from? Is it the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Canada, or somewhere else in the world? Please leave a comment and share it with us. It would be truly wonderful if people from all around the world could connect with one another, share their stories and feelings, and spread kindness and love through every video. Thank you for becoming a part of our community. We hope you enjoy a meaningful, peaceful, and heartwarming time watching this video. He was 48 years old, 6'2", built like a man who had once carried lumber up scaffolding for 12 hours a day, and never quite lost the habit of standing like he might have to again at any moment. People in Charleston called him the builder, sometimes the founder, and at the right kind of party and the right kind of reverent whisper, simply Calloway, the way you'd say the name of a mountain, or a storm that had already passed through and left everyone a little more careful. He had built Calloway Builders out of nothing but blistered hands and a stubborn refusal to stay poor. He had believed walking into this house tonight that nothing left in the world could really touch him anymore. He was wrong, and the wrongness of it moved through his chest, like something structural, giving way a beam he'd trusted for years, quietly splitting down its grain, silent until the exact moment it wasn't. The wall between the kitchen and the sitting room was thin by design. He'd told the architect he wanted it that way. An old farmhouse touch, he'd said, something that made the place feel lived, in a house where no one was ever truly out of earshot of the people they loved. He remembered saying that with something close to pride. He stood now on the other side of his own good idea, and understood with the flat, sick clarity of a man watching a load-bearing wall crack in real time, exactly what it had cost him. Through the gap where the kitchen door didn't quite meet its frame, he could see her. Vanessa was folded onto the leather sofa he'd chosen because she'd once mentioned in passing months ago that she loved that particular shade of cognac. He had remembered that detail the way he remembered rebar specifications filed, it away as something worth building around. The engagement ring caught the light every time she gestured on the phone, a small blinding flash over and over, like something signaling for help that no one was coming to answer. Someone like him. He hadn't heard that phrase yet, not tonight, but he already knew with the certainty of a man who had spent 30 years reading blueprints for hairline flaws before they became catastrophes that it was coming. He could feel the shape of it in the air the way he could feel rain before the sky had fully committed to it. This was the rehearsal night for the Riverside Commons, launch 3 years of planning distilled into a single evening, the largest, most consequential announcement of his career. He had chosen the flowers himself. He had personally walked the seating chart twice. He had stood in front of the mirror in his home office at 5 that morning and practiced his opening remarks, the way he used to practice job site safety briefings back when he couldn't yet afford a suit that fit him properly. And somewhere beneath all of it, quieter than he wanted to admit, even to himself, he had wanted Vanessa to be proud of him tomorrow night. Not proud of the buildings, proud of him. Something in him reached backward the way it always did in moments like this, sliding involuntarily down through decades to a place he rarely let himself visit. He was 12 again. A 2-room house at the edge of a hollow in West Virginia, wind finding every gap between the boards the way water finds every crack in a dam. His father, Wade, had been dead 6 weeks, a coal company, a 2-sentence letter with no signature, and his father's name spelled wrong. His mother took in other people's laundry after that, her knuckles raw and cracking from lye soap in a sink with no hot water. He remembered, with a clarity that still tightened his jaw, 26 years later, the particular humiliating arithmetic of counting how many logs were left against, how many nights of winter remained, and the night not long after the funeral when he'd gone to bed hungry because there wasn't quite enough to go around, and he was the oldest, old enough to understand what that meant without being told. He remembered lying there listening to his little sister cough through the wall, listening to the wind test every seam in the house, and making a promise to himself in the dark, the kind of promise a boy makes when he has nothing else left to hold on to. No one will ever look at me like that again. No one will ever get to decide what I am. He had kept that promise for 36 years. He had poured it into steel and glass and 12 states' worth of housing developments, built it so high and so wide. He had genuinely believed right up until this exact moment, standing in his own kitchen with a spoon in his hand, that it could no longer be reached. He'd never admit it. Vanessa went on, her voice dropping into something almost fond and almost cruel. The two now indistinguishable to him, but I think part of him still can't believe someone like me would want someone like out him. It's kind of adorable, actually. In a sad way. There it was. The phrase he'd already felt coming. Nathaniel set the ladle down on the marble counter. He did it slowly, deliberately, the way he'd once learned to set down a nail gun on an unstable scaffold. No sudden movements. Nothing that might bring the whole structure down before he was ready to be the one who brought it down. His hand did not shake. He noted that distantly, the way he might note that a beam was still holding, even after the crack had already started for now. He thought of Earl Whitfield's woodshop, the smell of fresh-cut oak, the old man's voice telling him once patiently the way you tell a boy something he'll need decades to understand. A house built strong isn't strong because it's big. It's strong because its foundation is honest. He had spent 20 years believing he understood that lesson. Standing here now, he understood for the first time that he had built an empire on a foundation he had never once thought to inspect. He straightened his tie. He exhaled once through his nose, the same measured breath he'd taught himself on his very first job site at 22, back when he was desperate enough to sleep in his truck, rather than turn down a single day of work, back when a foreman's shouting had taught him exactly how to make his face say nothing at all. He arranged his features now with that same old disciplined jaw, loose mouth, soft eyes, unreadable into the expression of a man who had heard nothing. He pushed open the kitchen door and stepped into the sitting room. Vanessa looked up, ended the call with a light, practiced laugh, and set the phone face down on the arm of the sofa. "There you are," she said, rising to meet him, sliding her arms around his neck as though the last 90 seconds had never happened. "I was just telling Britt about the seating chart. Everything's going to be perfect tomorrow." "I know it will," he said, and his voice came out steady, even warm, the voice of a man discussing centerpieces, not a man standing inside the wreckage of his own chest. "Can I get you more wine?" "You read my mind," she said, smiling up at him, and for one disorienting second he searched her face for any trace of the woman he'd just heard through the wall and found none. That more than the words themselves was the part that would keep him awake later, how completely one face could hold two entirely different women, and how long he had only ever been shown the one. He smiled back at her. It was, he would think much later, the last easy smile he ever gave her. He crossed to the wine cooler, drew out the bottle, and poured. His hand did not shake. Somewhere behind that steady hand, and that borrowed smile, in a place no blueprint could measure, and no contractor could reinforce, something that had taken him 36 years to build, had just begun very quietly to fracture. He did not yet know how deep the crack ran. He only knew, with the same old instinct that had once told a 12-year-old boy exactly how many logs were left in the woodpile, that a foundation once compromised does not stay hidden for long. Outside, beyond the tall windows of the house he had built with his own hands and every dollar he had once sworn, he would never have the Charleston night settled in, dark, warm, and entirely ordinary, utterly unaware that it was about to become, for Nathaniel Calloway, the last easy night of his old life. Nathaniel did not sleep that night. He lay beside Vanessa in the dark, listening to the slow, untroubled rhythm of her breathing, and understood with a strange, almost clinical detachment that a woman who had said what she'd said into a phone an hour earlier was capable of falling asleep in his arms within minutes of saying it. He found that he envied her for it. He had never once in 48 years managed to sleep on top of an unresolved thing. He got up sometime after midnight and went down to the kitchen, the same counter, the ladle still resting where he'd set it down, gone cold now in its pot. He didn't turn on the overhead light. He stood in the blue wash coming off the range hood, and let his mind do what it always did when the ground shifted under him. It went backward, all the way back to the place where the ground had first taught him how to shift. He had been born in a hollow outside a town, so small it didn't warrant its own exit off the interstate, in a 2-room house his father had built himself out of whatever lumber a mining wage could stretch to cover. Wade Calloway had gone down into Ridgeline number 9 6 days a week for 11 years, and Nathaniel could still recall with a precision that surprised him, even now, the sound his father's boots made on the porch steps every evening, 2 beats slower than a well man's walk. The sound of a body that had spent a decade being asked to give more than it had. He was 12 the winter his father didn't come home. There had been no dramatic scene, no phone call in the night that he could remember clearly, only his mother's face at the kitchen table 2 days later, and a letter from the company that used 2 sentences to describe the end of a man's life and still managed to spell his name wrong in the second one. An unforeseeable accident, it said. Nathaniel had read that phrase so many times in the years since that it had stopped meaning anything at all, the way any word does when you hold it too long. His mother, Loretta, took in laundry after that other family's shirts, other family's good tablecloths, because there was nothing else in that hollow for a widow with 3 children and a debt to a company store that never quite forgave itself for existing. Nathaniel remembered her hands most of all, cracked at the knuckles year-round from lye soap and cold water because hot water cost money they didn't have. He remembered standing at her elbow some evenings, 12 and then 13 and then 14, doing arithmetic, that no child should have to do, counting split logs against the nights of winter still ahead, learning to read a sky for snow, the way other boys his age were learning box scores. There had been a night not long after the funeral when there simply hadn't been enough at the table, and he had told his mother he wasn't hungry so his younger sister could have his share. He remembered the specific hollow ache of that lie, not shame, exactly, something colder, and he remembered lying awake afterward, listening to the wind come through a gap in the boards near his shoulder, and making the kind of promise only a boy who has nothing left can make. No one will ever look at me like that again. No one will ever get to decide what I am. He left school at 16 to swing a hammer for a framing crew 2 counties over, sleeping some nights in the cab of a borrowed truck, rather than pay for gas to drive home and back. It was there, on a job replacing porch joists for a widow who couldn't pay full price, that he met Earl Whitfield, an old cabinet maker with sawdust permanently ground into the creases of his hands, who watched 16-year-old Nathaniel drive a nail crooked, said nothing, and simply handed him a second nail without comment. Nathaniel had worked for Earl on weekends for 2 years after that, unpaid, because Earl fed him lunch and taught him things no framing foreman ever bothered to. A house built strong isn't strong because it's big, Earl told him once, turning a plane over a piece of red oak with the patience of a man who had never once been in a hurry. It's strong because its foundation is honest. Earl's granddaughter Ellie Hartwell used to sit on the shop's front steps most afternoons with a paperback and a glass of sweet tea, waiting for her grandfather to close up. She was 17, the summer Nathaniel first worked up the nerve to sit down beside her without an excuse. They were both poor in the particular unglamorous way that didn't photograph well-patched jeans, a bicycle with 1 working brake, birthdays celebrated with a cake and nothing underneath the wrapping paper, and they had believed the way only the very young and the very broke can believe, that love was the one thing in the world that didn't require money to be real. He left for Charlotte at 21 to chase work on a bigger crew, promising to write, promising to come back for her the first Christmas he could afford the bus fare both ways. He meant it when he said it. But work bred more work, and Charlotte bred Raleigh, and Raleigh bred a small general contracting license with his name on it, and somewhere in the years it took him to build Calloway Builders out of a single pickup truck and a line of credit no bank wanted to give him. The letters home got shorter, and then stopped altogether. He told himself for a long time that it was the cost of building something worth coming back to. He understood now, standing barefoot in his own dark kitchen at 2 in the morning with a fortune he could not entirely explain the use of that. The truth had been simpler and less forgivable than that. He had let ambition do what poverty never managed to do to him. It had made him forget who he was, one silence at a time. 26 years later, Calloway Builders had offices in 12 states, a workforce that ran into the thousands, and an initial public offering 3 weeks out that analysts were already calling one of the largest of the decade for a privately held construction firm. Nathaniel had never once in all that climbing stopped eating lunch with the framing crews on his own job sites. He still remembered the names of drivers' wives, the ages of their kids, which foreman's father had just had a hip replaced. He had built an empire, and somewhere underneath the steel and the glass he had never quite stopped being the boy counting logs against the winter. He had met Vanessa Sinclair 18 months earlier, at a hospital fundraiser he'd nearly skipped in a ballroom 2 blocks from the harbor. She had crossed the room toward him with the kind of unhurried confidence he had spent 30 years trying to fake in front of investors, and she had made him laugh twice within the first 5 minutes, a rare thing for a man who had trained himself out of easy laughter. Somewhere around the age of 17, he had proposed to her 8 months ago on Kiowa Island at low tide, the sky doing something extravagant and orange over the water, and she had cried. He remembered believing entirely that the tears were real. His best friend Walt Reeves had not liked her from the start. Walt had known Nathaniel since the 3rd grade, back in the hollow back before either of them had 2 nickels to their name between them, and Walt was the only person left alive who still called him Natty without irony. She looks at you like a balance sheet, not a man, Walt had told him once quietly over sawdust and bad coffee in his small wood shop outside town. Nathaniel had laughed it off then. He was not laughing now. Standing in the dark kitchen, replaying the sound of Vanessa's voice through the wall, someone like him. It's kind of adorable in a sad way. Nathaniel understood with the same cold clarity that had once told a 12-year-old exactly how many logs were left in the woodpile that it had spent 36 years building himself into a man no one could ever again call poor, and had somehow still ended up in his own house being called something almost as small. He rinsed the ladle in the sink, dried it, and set it back in its drawer. Whatever was coming, and something was coming. He could feel it now, the way he used to feel weather before it arrived. He intended to meet it the way Earl Whitfield had taught him, to meet everything quietly, patiently, and only after checking the foundation first. He climbed the stairs before sunrise, slid back into bed beside a woman he no longer entirely recognized, and lay perfectly still listening to her breathe, until the first gray light came up over the harbor. Morning came in gray and ordinary over the harbor, and Nathaniel got up before his alarm the way he always did after a night that hadn't given him any real sleep. He showered, dressed, and stood for a moment at the bathroom mirror, knotting his tie, watching his own hands do it, without needing to think the way he'd once watched them tie off rebar without thinking, and told himself that whatever he had heard through that wall he would not let it show. Not today. Today was the rehearsal for Riverside Commons. Today 300 people would watch him for cracks, and he had spent 30 years learning not to give them any. Vanessa was already at the table when he came downstairs, scrolling through a tablet full of seating charts and floral mock-ups, her hair still damp from the shower, humming something under her breath. She looked in the honest morning light exactly like the woman he'd fallen in love with 18 months ago, which was he was beginning to understand precisely the problem. Nothing about her had changed, only what he knew. "Morning," she said, not looking up. I switched the centerpieces to the lower arrangements. The tall ones were blocking sightlines to the stage. "Good call," he said, and poured his coffee and marveled distantly at how easily the words came out, sounding like a man with nothing on his mind. He spent the day the way he spent most days that mattered, in motion, deliberate, and controlled. He walked the Riverside Commons site with his construction manager before 8, checking grade elevations against the civil drawings with his own boots in the mud, the way he still did on every project, no matter how large the company grew. He sat through 4 hours of investor briefings that afternoon, fielding questions about the initial public offering with the same even, unhurried voice he'd used at 19 to talk a skeptical foreman into giving him a second chance on a framing job. He signed off on a change order for the parking structure. He called his mother in the early evening the way he did every Thursday, and told her the flowers for tomorrow were yellow, her favorite, and that he loved her, and none of it, not one word of it, carried any trace of the thing sitting lodged behind his ribs since midnight. He was good at this. He had always been good at this. It was, he thought, sometimes the one skill poverty had given him that money had never managed to take back: the ability to keep working with a wound nobody else could see. That night, the rehearsal dinner for the following evening's gala ran late, a small private affair at the house for the event planners and 2 members of the board. By the time the last car pulled out of the drive, it was nearly 11, and Nathaniel told Vanessa he had a few emails to finish before bed. It wasn't strictly a lie. He did have emails. He also had a reason, one he hadn't fully admitted to himself yet, for wanting to be alone in the house with the lights low and his ears open. He sat in his home office at the end of the hall, laptop open, doing nothing in particular with it, when he heard Vanessa's voice again, quieter this time, more careful, pitched the way a person pitches their voice when they believe a closed door is doing more work than it actually is. The thin wall he'd once been so proud of carried her words down the hallway as faithfully as it had carried them through the kitchen the night before. "No, he hasn't figured anything out," she said. A pause, someone answering on the other end. "The launch is still on schedule for tomorrow night. I'll have the final numbers pulled together before Friday." Nathaniel's hands went still over the keyboard. There was a soft laugh, then low, private, entirely unlike any laugh he had ever heard her give him. "Don't worry about it, Dominic," she said. "I know exactly what I'm doing." The name moved through him like something physical, a low electrical current finding the shortest path to ground. He sat perfectly motionless, laptop screen glowing uselessly in front of him, and let the name settle into a shape he hadn't touched in over 20 years. Dominic Regis. He had not spoken that name aloud since he was 22 years old, broke sleeping in the cab of a borrowed truck working for a contractor who had promised him and 11 other men 3 months of back wages, and delivered instead. It filed bankruptcy, and a company suddenly mysteriously reincorporated under his wife's maiden name. Nathaniel had lost his apartment that spring. He had lost the truck not long after, when the payments finally caught up to him. He remembered, with a clarity that surprised him even now, standing outside a locked construction trailer in the rain with 10 other men watching Dominic Reyes drive away in a car none of them could have afforded to wash. That man was now the chairman of Meridian Coastal Holdings, Calloway Builders' most aggressive, most litigious competitor, a company that had twice attempted hostile maneuvers against Nathaniel's firm, using legal tactics his own. Lawyers had once called in a rare, unguarded moment, borderline, predatory. Nathaniel had spent a decade being careful around that name the way a man learns to be careful around a scar that never quite stopped aching in cold weather. And now Vanessa, his fiancée, the woman whose ring he had chosen with more care than he'd ever put into a single line item on a 9-figure contract, had just said that name into a phone with an intimacy that made something in his stomach turn over slowly like a foundation settling. Wrong. He sat there a long time after her footsteps faded back down the hallway and up the stairs, the laptop screen eventually dimming and going dark in front of him, and understood that whatever this was, it had stopped being a private wound. Moment Dominic Reyes's name entered the room. This was no longer only a story about a man discovering his fiancée didn't respect him. This was, he suspected, something with teeth, something that reached directly into the initial public offering. He had spent 3 years building toward an offering only 6 people inside his company had been given full access to. Vanessa was the 7th. He thought of the launch materials sitting in a secured folder on the company's internal servers, pricing models, investor tiers, the confidential valuation figures the board hadn't even shared with most of senior leadership. Yet, he thought of how naturally Vanessa had folded herself into the planning of this week, offering to help coordinate messaging for the launch, offering to review the public-facing materials for Tone, and how he had thanked her for it, grateful at the time, to have a partner who cared enough about his work to want to be close to it. He sat in the dark of his office for a long while, the house gone silent around him, and felt something shift into place that had nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with the particular cold discipline his father's death had taught him at 12 years old, the discipline of counting. Exactly what you had left before you let yourself feel anything about what you'd lost. He would not confront her tonight. He would not confront her tomorrow at the launch in front of 300 people and a room full of cameras. He understood with a certainty that settled over him the way frost settles over a field, quiet, total, undeniable by morning, that this required patience, not anger. It required the same thing. Every structural failure he had ever diagnosed required proof before action, evidence before blame, a full inspection before a single wall came down. He closed the laptop. He walked down the hallway past the bedroom door, where Vanessa's reading lamp had already gone dark, and stood for a moment in the doorway, listening to her breathe slow, even untroubled, the breathing of a woman who believed tonight that she had gotten away with something. Not for long, he thought, and the thought arrived in a voice that didn't entirely sound like his own, older, harder, closer to the boy who had once stood in the rain outside a locked trailer and promised himself he would never again be the last person in the room to understand what was happening to him. He got into bed beside her without waking her. He lay on his back and stared at the ceiling for a long time, running the same handful of words over and over the way he used to review a budget discrepancy, once for the shock of it, once for the facts. I know exactly what I'm doing, Dominic. The facts didn't get softer the second time through. They only got clearer. He did not fall asleep again that night. Not really, only drifted in and out of something thin and gray, surfacing every so often to the sound of Vanessa's even breathing beside him, until the room began to lighten at the edges and he gave up on rest altogether. By the time the sun was fully up, he had made a decision, the only kind he trusted anymore. He would not sit alone with this. He needed one voice in the world that had no stake in his money, his company, or his wedding, and there was only one man alive who fit that description. He told Vanessa over coffee that he had a supplier issue out at the Riverside site and would be back by evening. It was, he noted with a small, unfamiliar discomfort, the second lie he had told her in as many days. He had never been a man who lied easily. He was discovering in real time that it got easier with practice, and he did not like what that discovery told him about where the next few weeks were headed. Walt Reeves ran his shop out past the edge of town in a converted tobacco barn he'd bought for almost nothing 15 years earlier, and slowly turned into one of the finest small furniture operations in the low country. Dovetail joints, cut by hand, finishes mixed from recipes older than either of them, everything built the way Earl Whitfield had once built things, patient and exact. Nathaniel had put up part of the money for the roof and the new saws a decade ago, quietly, the way he did most things for people he loved. and Walt had paid every dollar of it back within 4 years, even though Nathaniel had told him more than once not to bother. He found Walt exactly where he expected to, hunched over a bandsaw in the amber wash of the shop's overhead lights, sawdust drifting through the air like something suspended in water. Walt looked up, took one look at Nathaniel's face, and killed the saw's motor without being asked. "Natty," he said, wiping his hands on his apron, already moving toward him. "What happened?" Nathaniel told him everything, standing there among the half-finished tables and the smell of fresh oak, not sparing himself anything. The phone call in the kitchen, the word sweet wielded like a small, precise knife, and then the night after the second call, quieter, more careful, ending with a name Nathaniel hadn't said out loud in over 2 decades. "Dominic Reyes," he said finally, and watched something pass across Walt's face that wasn't surprise. It was recognition, old weathered recognition, the kind you carry for a wound you'd hoped had scarred over. "That son of a bitch," Walt said quietly, and then after a pause, "You remember what he did to you? To all of us on that crew." "I remember," Nathaniel said. "I just don't understand what he wants with Vanessa, or what she wants with him." Walt didn't answer right away. He walked to the small refrigerator in the corner of the shop, took out 2 bottles of water, and handed one to Nathaniel. Without a word, a habit from 35 years of friendship, the kind of gesture that didn't need explaining. Between them, he sat down heavily on an overturned crate, elbows on his knees, and looked up at Nathaniel with an expression that was, for the first time in the conversation, not entirely about sympathy. "I told you about her from the first month," Walt said. It wasn't an accusation, not quite. Walt had never been a man who took satisfaction in being right about something painful, but there was a weariness in it that Nathaniel felt land somewhere below his ribs. "I told you she looked at you like a balance sheet, not a man. You laughed it off. I know what I did. I'm not trying to rub it in your face, Natty. I'm trying to tell you I'm not shocked, and that scares me more than if I was." Walt turned the water bottle over in his hands, not drinking from it, just needing something to do with them. A woman like that doesn't end up tangled with a man like Dominic Reyes by accident. Whatever this is, it's been building longer than you think. "She loves me, Walt." The words came out smaller than he meant them to, not a statement so much as something he was still trying against the weight of everything he'd heard through 2 thin walls in 2 nights to believe was still true. Walt didn't argue with him. He didn't need to. He simply looked at Nathaniel for a long moment, with an expression that held no judgment at all, only the particular grief of a man watching someone he loved walk toward a door he already knew what was behind. "She loves the name on the building, Natty," Walt said finally, gently, "the way you'd tell a friend a diagnosis you wished you didn't have to. I don't know if there's a difference to her. I hope I'm wrong. I don't think I am." Nathaniel sat down on the crate beside him, the two of them quiet for a while amid the smell of cut wood and machine oil. 12-year-old boys grown into a billionaire and a cabinet maker, still somehow speaking the same language. They'd learned on the same dirt road 35 years ago. He thought, not for the first time, that there was a particular kind of loneliness in being a man. Other people needed things from a loneliness. Walt had never once made him feel not in 35 years, not for one single day. "I'm not going to do anything rash," Nathaniel said finally. "I need to know exactly what's happening before I do anything at all. If I confront her now based on 2 overheard phone calls, she'll have an explanation ready before I finish the sentence. I need facts, not feelings." Walt nodded slowly, the old practical nod of a man who had spent his whole life fitting pieces of wood together with more patience than most people gave to their own marriages. "That's the right way to do it," he said. "You were always better at that than me. Slow and exact." He paused, and something flickered across his face again, quick, almost imperceptible, gone before Nathaniel could name it. "Whatever you need, I'm here. You know that." "I know," Nathaniel said, and meant it completely. He did not notice in that moment the particular tightness that had settled into the corners of Walt's eyes when Dominic Reyes' name had first come up, a tightness that had nothing to do with old grievances from a construction site 2 decades gone, and everything to do with something far more recent, far closer to home, that Walt had not yet found the courage to say out loud. Nathaniel was too far inside his own collapsing foundation to notice that his oldest friend was standing on a fault line of his own. They talked for another hour, mostly about nothing: the Riverside Project, a college football score, Walt's daughter's upcoming recital, the ordinary, unremarkable texture of 2 men trying to hold something steady between them simply by continuing to talk. When Nathaniel finally stood to leave, the sky outside had gone the deep orange of late afternoon, throwing long bars of light across the shop floor through the barn's old windows. "Hey," Walt said, catching him at the door. "Whatever this turns into, and I think it's going to turn into something, you're not doing it alone." "You hear me?" "I hear you," Nathaniel said. He drove back toward Charleston with the windows down, the humid evening air thick with the smell of salt marsh and cut grass, and turned the conversation over in his mind the whole way home. Walt had given him exactly what he'd come for, not answers but permission to move slowly, and the quiet certainty that whatever he found he wouldn't have to carry it by himself. What he didn't yet know and wouldn't learn for many weeks was that his oldest friend had just spent an hour sitting across from him with a secret of his own, lodged somewhere behind his sternum, a secret that had everything to do with Dominic Reyes, and nothing at all to do with Vanessa Sinclair. And that would eventually cost Walt more than either of them could imagine on that ordinary orange evening in the woodshop. Two men who had once been boys on the same dirt road, still believing for now that the only thing either of them had to fear was the truth about a woman. He couldn't sleep that night either, and by 2 in the morning he had stopped pretending to try. He slipped out of bed without waking Vanessa, padded down the hallway to his home office and sat down at his desk with the kind of restless, purposeless energy that used to send him out onto job sites before dawn as a young man unable to simply lie still with a problem he hadn't yet solved. He told himself, opening his laptop, that he was only going to look up Dominic Reyes out of habit, the same due diligence instinct that made him run background checks on every subcontractor Calloway Builders had ever hired, the same caution that had kept his company solvent through 2 recessions, while competitors folded around him. He wasn't expecting to find anything he didn't already know. Dominic Reyes was a known quantity in his world, chairman of Meridian Coastal Holdings, a man with a reputation for lawsuits filed just aggressively enough to cost a smaller competitor money, without ever quite crossing into something a judge would sanction. Nathaniel had read every public filing on the man twice over the years, the way you study an opponent's game film. He started out of that same old habit further back than he usually bothered to go into the corporate history, search his legal team used for vetting new partners, the kind of database that could trace a company's ownership chain back through decades of mergers, shell entities, and dissolved LLCs. He typed Dominic Reyes' name into the search field and began scrolling backward through the 1990s, past the string of small construction outfits Reyes had run before rebuilding himself as a real estate developer, past 2 bankruptcies that had conveniently reincorporated under other names. And then a line item stopped him cold. Ridgeline Coal Holdings. He sat very still, staring at the screen, feeling something in his chest drop the way a floor drops out from under a man who has just discovered mid-step that a joist beneath him has already failed. Ridgeline Coal Holdings was the parent company that had owned Ridgeline No. 9, the mine where his father had died. He knew that name the way he knew his own birthday, though he had not typed it into a search bar in over 20 years, had in fact spent most of his adult life carefully steering conversations away from it whenever it threatened to surface. He clicked into the ownership records with hands that were for the first time in longer than he could remember visibly unsteady. The chairman of the board of Ridgeline Coal Holdings in the years leading up to the accident, 28 years old at the time according to the filing, had been Dominic Reyes. Nathaniel sat back in his chair. The office around him, the built-in shelving, the framed rendering of the Riverside Commons project, the small brass model of the very first apartment building he'd ever developed, kept on the corner of his desk as a reminder of where he'd started. All of it seemed to recede into the background, replaced by something colder and much older. He spent the next 2 hours doing what he did best, building a record. He found an archived newspaper article from the regional paper, digitized years after the fact by a local historical society, its scanned print gone slightly yellow at the edges, even in pixels. A retired federal mine safety inspector, quoted in the piece under his full name with a photograph, alleged that Ridgeline Coal had received 3 separate warnings in the 6 months before the collapse regarding the mine's roof support systems, and had chosen not to act on any of them. The repairs would have required a costly shutdown, just as the company was preparing to court new investors. The federal investigation that followed the accident had been closed within a year, the article noted, citing insufficient evidence to establish willful negligence. No one had ever been held responsible. The company had paid a modest settlement to the 6 families of the men who died, and Ridgeline Coal Holdings had quietly dissolved 4 years later, its assets folded into other ventures, its name scrubbed from most public record, except, apparently, from this one. Nathaniel found a photograph buried in the same archived article, grainy and small, captioned only with a list of the deceased. His father's face looked back at him from the screen. Younger than Nathaniel, was now by nearly a decade, thinner, tired, in a way that photographs from that era always seemed to make poor men look, wearing an expression Nathaniel didn't fully recognize because he had so few photographs of his father at all. He had never seen this particular picture before in his life. He sat with it for a long time, the office silent around him, except for the low hum of the laptop fan, and felt something move through his chest, that he did not have an easy name for grief, certainly old and familiar but braided now with something sharper, something closer to the particular focused, the fury of a man who has just discovered that the wound he'd spent 36 years learning to live around had a name attached to it the entire time, and that the name belonged to a person still alive, still wealthy, still walking free through rooms Nathaniel himself was sometimes invited into. The man who had, by every indirect measure Nathaniel now had in front of him, contributed to his father's death 26 years ago, was the same man his own fiancée had just been overheard speaking to on the phone with an intimacy that turned Nathaniel's stomach. It was not a coincidence he could make peace with sitting alone at 2 a.m. It was, he understood slowly, exactly the kind of thing that demanded he stop treating this entire situation as a single contained betrayal and start treating it as something with roots that went far deeper than an engagement ring or a leaked business document. He called Walt at 2:30, aware, even as he dialed, that it was an unreasonable hour and unable to make himself care. Walt picked up on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep, but immediately alert the way it always went. Whenever Nathaniel called outside of daylight hours, a reflex built over 35 years of knowing exactly what an off-hours call from each other meant. "Natty, what's wrong?" "Ridgeline Coal Holdings," Nathaniel said, and heard his own voice come out rougher than he intended. That was the company that owned the mine, the one my dad died in. A silence on the other end, thick enough that Nathaniel could hear Walt sitting up in bed, the creak of a mattress 200 miles of phone line away. Dominic Reyes chaired the board, Nathaniel said. Before any of the trouble on our old crew. Before Meridian. He was 28 years Daughtry then. Daughtry war. Meant. That's the company that let that mine fall in on 11 men, including my father, because fixing it would have cost him money right before a funding round. Jesus Natty. Walt's voice had dropped to something low and careful, the voice of a man realizing in real time that the ground under a conversation had just shifted into something far more dangerous than either of them had prepared for. "You think he had something to do with it directly?" "I don't know yet," Nathaniel said, and it was, he realized, the most honest sentence he'd spoken in 2 days. "But I'm going to find out. I need everything, records, filings, whatever's still sitting in a county courthouse somewhere in West Virginia that never made it online. And I need you with me on this, not just on the Vanessa thing. This is bigger than that now." There was another pause, shorter this time, and when Walt spoke again, his voice had steadied into something Nathaniel recognized from 35 years of friendship, the particular unshakable calm Walt reserved for the moments that actually mattered. "I'm with you," Walt said. "Whatever you need. I mean it, Natty. Whatever it takes." Nathaniel sat in the dark of his office long after the call ended, the laptop screen eventually dimming to black in front of him, and thought of the boy he had been at 12 years old, doing arithmetic against a woodpile, believing that if he simply worked hard enough, the unfairness of the world would eventually balance itself out. He was 48 now, and he understood, sitting there with his father's unfamiliar photograph still glowing faintly in his mind, that the world did not balance itself out on its own. Somebody had to do the balancing. He had spent his whole life building things. It occurred to him for the first time with real clarity that he might finally be about to build something that mattered more than any tower of glass and steel he had ever put his name on, the truth laid out plainly for a family that had waited 26 years to hear it. He did not go back to bed that night. He sat at his desk until the windows began to lighten, methodically pulling together every scrap of the record he could find, building his case, the only way he had ever known how to build anything, one honest board at a time, checked twice, never resting on a foundation he hadn't personally inspected. The sun came up over the harbor while Nathaniel was still at his desk, and he watched it happen without really registering it the way you register a familiar sound, without listening to it, the light climbing slowly up the wall behind his monitor, turning the room from gray to gold, indifferent to the Dalma fact that the man sitting in it had not slept in nearly 48 hours, and had spent most of that time discovering that his fiancée and the man responsible, however indirectly, for his father's death might be the same conspiracy. He showered before Vanessa woke, dressed for the office, and left the house early enough that he didn't have to sit across from her at breakfast and hold his face still for an hour. He told himself it wasn't avoidance. He knew, driving in through the low morning traffic along the peninsula, that it was exactly that, and that he didn't yet have the discipline to pretend otherwise. He arrived at the Calloway Builders headquarters before 7, before even the earliest of his executive assistants, and let himself into his corner office on the top floor, with the particular quiet of a man who wanted for once to be alone, with his own thoughts before the building filled up with people who needed things from him. He stood at the window for a while, looking out over the cranes rising above the Riverside Commons site 3 miles up the river, steel skeletons catching the early light, and thought about the IPO materials sitting somewhere inside his own company's servers, the pricing models, the confidential valuation figures, the investor tier lists that only 6 people were supposed to have full access to. He thought about how naturally Vanessa had folded herself into that circle of 6 over the past several months, offering to help shape the public messaging for the launch, offering always, so reasonably, always in a way that made sense at the time to review drafts of the investor materials for Tone. Before they went to the board, he had thanked her for it. He had been, God help him, grateful. He did not trust his own IT department to run this quietly. Too many of them reported one way or another up through channels that eventually touched the same executive floor Vanessa moved through with her visitor badge. Instead, he made a call to a woman named Priya Nair, a cybersecurity consultant he'd used twice before for sensitive due diligence on acquisitions, a former government contractor who had left federal work years ago to build her own small, fiercely discreet firm. Priya answered on the first ring the way people who took security seriously always seemed to. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "It's early. I need something looked at," he said, quietly. "Outside my own building systems, if that's possible." "It's always possible," Priya said. "Tell me what I'm looking for." He explained as much as he was willing to over the phone access logs on a secured internal server, holding confidential materials for an upcoming initial public, offering a name he wanted cross-referenced against every login and download in the past 4 months. No explanation given beyond the provined fact that he needed to know cleanly and completely exactly what that name had touched. Priya didn't ask him why. That he thought afterward was part of what he was paying her for. "I can have a preliminary report in 48 hours, she said. "I'll need remote access to the log files themselves, not summaries. And Mr. Calloway, whatever this turns out to be, I'd recommend you not discuss it with anyone inside your company until you've seen what I find." "I wasn't planning to," he said, and meant it. He spent the rest of that day the way he'd spent the one before it, in motion, deliberate, giving nothing away. He sat through a 2-hour meeting with the underwriting bank on final IPO pricing, nodding at the right moments, asking sharp, informed questions about the roadshow schedule, a version of himself performing competence, so convincingly that even his own chief financial officer complimented him. Afterward, on how calm he seemed given how close the launch was, Nathaniel thanked him and said nothing about the fact that calm for him had become something he built the same way. He built everything else plank by plank over a hole he was careful not to let anyone see the bottom of. 48 hours later, almost to the hour, Priya called back. "I found something," she said. "No." Preamble. The flat, careful tone of a professional delivering bad news without editorializing it. "Miss Sinclair's credentials have limited authorized access to a portion of the public relations materials for the launch, completely appropriate given her outside consulting role. But the log files show her account accessing folders well outside that scope. Internal financial modeling. The strategic investor list. The confidential valuation figures the board hasn't circulated below senior leadership." Nathaniel sat very still, the phone pressed to his ear, watching the cranes move slowly against the skyline outside his window. "The access pattern is consistent," Priya continued. "Every Tuesday afternoon between roughly noon and 2 o'clock. Same window almost to the minute, 4 weeks running." Nathaniel didn't need to check his own calendar to know what filled that window. Vanessa had told him more times than he could count over the past month that Tuesday afternoons were reserved for client meetings, a standing appointment. She'd mentioned so often and so casually that he had never once thought to ask which client or where. "I want everything documented," Nathaniel said, his voice coming out steadier than he expected, the old discipline reasserting itself the way it always had ever since he was a boy, learning to keep his face still in front of a foreman who didn't tolerate weakness. Screenshots, timestamps, access logs, all of it clean in a format that would hold up if this ever needed to go further than the 2 of us. "Already compiling it," Priya said. "I'll have the full package to you within the week." He thanked her and ended the call, and sat alone in his office for a long moment afterward, doing the thing he did instinctively with any piece of bad news that landed on his desk, breaking it down into its component parts the way he'd break down a failed inspection report, looking for the load-bearing fact underneath all the surrounding noise. The load-bearing fact here was simple and terrible. Someone with intimate access to his life had been quietly siphoning the most sensitive information his company possessed, on a predictable schedule for at least a month, possibly longer, and doing it in a way specifically designed never to raise a single flag inside his own organization. That night he sat across from Vanessa at dinner, the two of them at the long table in the dining room she'd redecorated the year before. Candles lit, a bottle of wine open between them that he'd chosen because she'd once mentioned liking the label. She talked animated and warm about the flower arrangements for the following night's gala, about a seating conflict she'd resolved between two board members who apparently didn't care for each other, about how excited she was to finally see 3 years of his work come together in one room. He refilled her glass at the right moment. He nodded at the right pauses. He asked a follow-up question about the seating chart that made her light up, pleased that he'd been listening. Underneath the table, out of her line of sight, his hand was steady on his own wine glass, and inside his chest, a structure he had spent 30 years learning to build without a single visible flaw was being quietly, methodically dismantled and rebuilt into something else entirely. Not a marriage anymore. Not even a betrayal exactly, but a case. Evidence. A record he intended to make so complete, so meticulously documented, that when the moment finally came to bring it into the light, no one in that room tomorrow night would be able to look away from it. Least of all the two people who had spent 4 months believing he hadn't noticed a thing. He had learned a very long time ago in a hollow in West Virginia with a woodpile and a hard winter ahead of him that the only thing worse than counting your losses was counting them too late. He did not intend to make that mistake twice. The gala came and went the following night in a blur. Nathaniel would later have trouble reconstructing in any real detail. The tent along the river, the string lights, the sound of 300 people applauding as he stood at the podium and talked about affordable housing for working families. The same speech he'd rehearsed alone in his mirror at 5 in the morning, a week earlier, delivered now, with Vanessa standing beside him, in a pale blue dress, her hand resting lightly on his arm at exactly the moment the photographers wanted it there. He got through it. He shook the hands he needed to shake. He laughed at the jokes he needed to laugh at, and somewhere in the middle of it all, watching Dominic Reyes's absence from the guest list with something like relief, he understood that the true confrontation hadn't even begun yet. Tonight was only ceremony. What came next would be substance. Priya's full report arrived 6 days later, delivered in person to a coffee shop, 2 counties outside Charleston, that Nathaniel had chosen specifically because no one there would recognize either of them. She slid a slim folder across the table without ceremony, the kind of woman who understood that the moment for pleasantries had already passed. "I traced the destination," she said. "The data pulled from your servers on those Tuesday sessions was routed through an anonymized relay, which took some work to unwind, but eventually it resolved to a domain registered to a company called Coastal Bridge Advisors, LLC. Nathaniel opened the folder. Inside were printed screenshots, timestamps aligned in neat columns, a corporate registration document with a state seal in the corner. The LLC was formed 4 months ago, Priya said. Delaware registration, which is standard for anyone who doesn't want their name showing up in an easy search. But Delaware still requires a registered agent listed on the formation paperwork, and this one didn't bother hiding behind a formation service. She tapped the second page. One name, sole listed officer and registered agent. Nathaniel didn't need to read it. He already knew the way he'd known the moment he heard the name through a thin wall 2 weeks earlier precisely, whose signature would be sitting at the bottom of that document. He read it anyway because some part of him, the part that had spent 30 years insisting on seeing every inspection report with his own eyes, before signing off on a single beam, needed to watch the letters form the shape of his own worst. Suspicion. Dominic Reyes. 4 months. He did the math without meaning to the same automatic arithmetic that had once told a 12-year-old exactly how many logs were left in a woodpile. 4 months. Put the formation of that shell company almost precisely at the point when Nathaniel had begun finalizing the last major terms of the public offering, the pricing bands, the strategic investor allocations, the numbers that, if leaked to a well-capitalized competitor before the launch, could allow that competitor to structure an aggressive short position and time a coordinated media campaign to gut investor confidence in the exact week Calloway builders needed it most. He sat with the folder open in front of him, the coffee shop's ordinary mid-morning noise continuing around him, a couple arguing gently about paint colors, 2 tables over the hiss of a milk steamer, a bell over the door, and felt the full shape of it settle into place with a clarity that was almost a relief, the way any correctly diagnosed structural failure is a relief once you finally understand exactly where the crack originates and how far it runs. Dominic Reyes could not take Calloway Builders by force. He had tried twice through hostile legal maneuvers. Nathaniel's team had beaten back both times, and a man like Dominic did not enjoy losing publicly a third time. So he had found another way in, not through the front door of a boardroom but through a woman positioned deliberately or not. Nathaniel still didn't fully know close enough to Nathaniel's life to be trusted with the keys to almost everything. "I want you to keep pulling on this," Nathaniel said, finally closing the folder. Quietly. "I need to know if there's more communications, financial transfers, anything that connects the two of them beyond this LLC. If we're going to bring this into the light, I want it airtight. Not a single loose thread anyone can grab onto." "Understood," Priya said. "There's one more thing you should know, though. It's not proof of anything yet, but it might matter. Go ahead." The relay I traced the data through the anonymized server. It's the same kind of infrastructure I've seen used before in cases involving planned short-selling campaigns. Somebody wanted advanced knowledge of your true valuation numbers before the market got them. That's not the profile of a jealous rival trying to embarrass you. That's the profile of someone planning to make money off your stock, cratering in a very specific, very timed way. Priya closed her own copy of the folder and looked at him directly. "If I'm right, this isn't just personal, Mr. Calloway. It's coordinated, and it means whoever's behind it has already thought several moves further ahead than you have." Nathaniel drove back into Charleston that afternoon with the folder locked in the console of his truck, the humid air pressing in through the open window, salt, marsh, and diesel, and cut grass all blending into the particular smell of a low-country summer he'd once thought, 20 years ago, that he might never be able to afford to live inside of. He thought about his father again, not the accident this time, but something smaller. An ordinary memory that surfaced without warning the way they sometimes did of Wade Calloway sitting at the kitchen table one evening with a ledger book showing a 12-year-old Nathaniel how to balance the household accounts against the coming winter, telling him, in his slow, unhurried way, that a man who understood his numbers could never be lied to about his own life. Nathaniel understood his numbers now better than almost anyone alive. He understood, driving home with a folder of evidence sitting a foot away from him, exactly how much had already been taken from him. Not just information, not just the sanctity of a relationship he'd believed in completely, but time, weeks, maybe months, during which Dominic Reyes and Vanessa Sinclair had been quietly assembling a weapon aimed directly at the company Nathaniel had spent 26 years building out of nothing. He arrived home before Vanessa did that evening, let himself into the empty house, and stood for a long moment in the kitchen, where all of this had started. The same counter, the same wine cooler, humming its low, indifferent hum, the same thin wall he had once been so proud of. He poured himself a glass of water. He didn't particularly want, just to have something to do with his hands, and thought about Earl Whitfield's voice, patient across 2 decades. A house built strong isn't strong because it's big. It's strong because its foundation is honest. He had spent his whole adult life building things people could trust, buildings that didn't crack contracts, that didn't collapse, a reputation that meant something in rooms full of men who had every incentive to lie to each other. He understood now, standing alone in his own kitchen with a folder of evidence in his truck outside, that the most important structure he had ever needed to inspect had been sitting in this house the entire time, invisible to him, load-bearing, and quietly failing. For months. He heard Vanessa's car pull into the drive a few minutes later, the familiar sound of the garage door, her heels on the hallway floor. He set his water glass down, arranged his face into the same expression he had been perfecting for 2 weeks. Now, jaw-loose mouth, soft eyes, unreadable, the look of a man who had heard nothing, seen nothing, and suspected absolutely nothing at all, and turned to greet her as she came through the door. "Hey, you," she said, crossing the kitchen to kiss his cheek, dropping her bag on the counter with the easy, unhurried confidence of a woman who had no idea the ground beneath her had already begun very quietly to give way. "Hey," he said, and smiled, and asked her how her day had been. She told him. He listened and nodded, and did not for one single moment let anything in his face give away the fact that somewhere in a locked console outside a folder full of dates and numbers was slowly, patiently becoming the last thing standing between him and the truth. He waited 9 days before he acted on the last piece of the picture Priya had given him, a single line buried in the access logs, easy to miss unless you were looking for it, showing that Vanessa's phone had pinged a cell tower near the historic district every Tuesday afternoon during the same 2-stock window she claimed for client meetings. 9 days of sitting across from her at dinner, 9 days of watching her plan centerpieces and thank you notes for a wedding that felt more each morning like a building he could see the cracks running through from the outside but was still legally required to walk into. He told her that Tuesday morning that he had a full day of supplier meetings out at a second site near Savannah and wouldn't be back until evening. It was by his own private count the 4th lie he had told her in 2 weeks, and he noticed with a discomfort that had started to feel almost familiar that he no longer flinched delivering them the way he had the first time. He did not go to Savannah. He drove instead into the historic district parked 2 blocks from the address the cell data had pointed toward a boutique hotel on Vendu Range with a wrought iron balcony and a discreet, expensive kind of anonymity built into its very architecture. The sort of place designed for people who wanted to be seen by no one who mattered, and sat in his truck wearing a plain baseball cap and a jacket he couldn't remember the last time he'd worn, feeling, for the first time in 26 years, exactly as small and exactly as powerless as he had felt standing outside a locked construction trailer in the rain at 22 years old. Money, he was learning, did not insulate a man from this particular kind of humiliation. It only changed the backdrop. At 12:15, Vanessa's car pulled up to the valet stand. He watched her step out, hand her keys to the attendant with the easy, practiced grace of a woman who had done this before, and walk into the lobby without once glancing over her shoulder. Not the posture of someone worried about being caught, but the posture of someone who had simply never imagined she might be. 10 minutes later, a black sedan pulled into the same drive, and Dominic Reyes stepped out. Nathaniel had not seen the man in person in over 2 decades, not since the week Reyes's company had filed for bankruptcy, and left 11 men, Nathaniel among them, chasing wages that never came. He had changed less than Nathaniel expected, silver-haired, now more polished. The cheap contractor's boots replaced by a tailored suit that probably cost more than Nathaniel's first pickup truck had, but the same unhurried, entitled walk, the walk of a man who had never once in his life waited in a line he didn't want to wait in. Nathaniel watched him cross the lobby and disappear inside, and felt something in his chest go very quiet and very cold. Not the hot, chaotic anger he might have expected, but something closer to the stillness that comes right before a controlled demolition, the moment after the charges are set, and before the button is pressed when everything is already decided, and there's nothing left to do but wait for the physics to catch up. He sat in that truck for 72 minutes. He counted them because counting was the only thing that kept his hands from shaking. When Vanessa and Dominic finally emerged together unhurried, mid-conversation, Dominic rested a hand against the small of her back as they crossed toward the valet stand, an easy, familiar gesture, the kind that comes from repetition, from a single accidental afternoon. Vanessa laughed at something, he said, tilting her head back, and Nathaniel watched the sunlight catch her face in an expression he realized with a small private ache. He had never once seen directed at himself in 18 months together. Not like that. Not that unguarded. He raised his phone and took 3 photographs, clean and clear, both their faces fully visible, timestamps embedded automatically. His hand did not shake even now. He noted that fact distantly, the way he noted most things about himself lately, from a slight remove, as though observing another man's careful discipline rather than his own. He drove back to the office afterward and sat through the remainder of his scheduled afternoon exactly as planned, a 2-hour design review with his lead architect on the Riverside Commons clubhouse. 3 change orders he reviewed, signed with his usual attention to detail, a call with the underwriting bank confirming the final IPO pricing range. Nobody in any of those rooms had the faintest idea that the man running the meeting with such calm, exacting focus had spent his lunch hour watching his fiancée walk out of a hotel with the man who may have helped kill his father. He drove home that evening at the hour he'd told her he would, walked in through the same door, and found Vanessa in the kitchen finishing a phone call, not the low, careful voice from before, but her ordinary voice, bright and unbothered, complaining good-naturedly to someone about a caterer who'd gotten the shrimp order wrong for Saturday's tasting. "Hey, you're back," she said, ending the call and crossing to kiss him. "How was Savannah long?" he said. "Productive, though. Good day." "I had client meetings all afternoon," she said, unprompted, the way liars sometimes offered information nobody had asked for, as if volume could substitute for truth. "Absolutely exhausting." "I bet," he said, and asked if she wanted him to start dinner. He cooked that night something simple, pasta with the good olive oil, a dish he'd learned from a foreman's wife on a job site in Raleigh 20 years earlier, and never stopped making when he wanted his hands occupied with something other than his own thoughts. He stood at the stove with his back to her, stirring, listening to her, set the table behind him, and felt the strange, dual nature of the moment settle over him like something physical. One version of himself standing in a warm kitchen with the woman he'd planned to marry, and another version standing 72 minutes in a parked truck outside a Topley hotel watching the whole architecture of his trust get quietly dismantled in real time. He had learned as a boy that grief had a particular geography to it, that it arrived in a place, attached itself to that place, and never fully left it afterward. He had never gone back to the house in the hollow after his mother sold it. He wondered now, plating the pasta, setting it down in front of Vanessa with a smile that cost him more than any smile he had ever given a room full of investors, whether this kitchen would become the same kind of place for him, a room he could never quite stand in again the same way, even after everything else about tonight had been resolved. "This is so good," Vanessa said, twirling pasta onto her fork entirely unaware. "You should cook more often." "Maybe I will," Nathaniel said, and meant it in a way she couldn't possibly understand, not as a domestic promise but as something closer to a private vow, the kind he'd made once before in a cold house at 12 years old. He was going to keep his hands steady. He was going to keep cooking dinner and refilling wine glasses and asking about caterers for exactly as long as it took to finish building the case that would, when it was ready, bring this entire house of cards down at a time and in a manner of his own choosing. He thought of Earl Whitfield again that night, lying awake beside her long after she'd fallen asleep. The old man's voice as clear in his memory as if he'd spoken it that afternoon. "You don't tear down a wall until you know for certain it isn't load-bearing." Nathaniel finally knew with total certainty now exactly what kind of wall he was dealing with. What remained was only a matter of timing, of choosing the precise moment and the precise room in which to let it fall. The courthouse records he needed for Ridgeline No. 9 didn't exist in any digital archive Priya could reach from a desk. County filings from that era, inspection, appeals, the original mine safety citations, the depositions taken during the brief federal inquiry that closed a year after the collapse had never been scanned. They sat, if they still existed at all, in a records room in the same county where Nathaniel had been born, 2 hours past the last town with a chain hotel. In a courthouse he hadn't set foot inside since he was a teenager, collecting his birth certificate to apply for a job that required one. He told no one but Walt where he was going. He left before dawn on a Thursday, drove north and west out of the low-country humidity, into the cooler air of the mountains, watching the land change the way it always did on this drive, flat coastal pine giving way hour by hour to ridgelines and hollows and the particular folded green of country he hadn't lived in for 26 years but still recognized in his body before his mind caught up. The county courthouse was smaller than he remembered, or he was larger than he'd been the last time he stood in front of it. He spent most of the day in a records room that smelled of dust and old paper, working alongside a patient clerk who pulled boxes he pointed to, and asked no questions about why a man in an expensive coat wanted federal mine safety citations from a company that had dissolved before she was born. By late afternoon he had what he'd come for: copies of the original citations, the safety inspector's handwritten notes, more than enough to corroborate everything the archived newspaper article had alleged. He should have driven straight back toward the interstate. Instead, some old gravity he didn't examine too closely pulled him instead toward the edge of town, past the gas station that had replaced the one from his childhood, past the church. His mother had stopped attending after his father died because she couldn't bear the sympathy in people's eyes toward a converted tobacco barn he still, after 2.5 decades, could have found with his eyes closed. Earl Whitfield's woodshop was still standing, though. A younger man ran it now. A non-profit sign out front announced a free trade skills program for local kids, funded the placard, said by a grant. Nathaniel didn't recognize the name of. He was still standing in the gravel lot reading it when a woman came out the front door carrying a stack of folders, and he felt the whole afternoon tilt sideways beneath him. Her hair was still pulled back the same way, though gray now threaded through the brown at her temples. She was reaching for her car keys before she looked up, and when she did, she went as still as he had. Nate Ellie Hartwell said, and it was the first time in 26 years anyone had used that particular shortened version of his name, the one that had belonged only to 17-year-old Summers on this exact patch of gravel, and hearing it now knocked something loose in his chest that he had spent decades bracing carefully against. They ended up at the only coffee shop still open in town, sitting across a small table from each other for 3 hours that felt somehow both entirely unfamiliar and exactly like picking up a sentence neither of them had finished 26 years earlier. She told him she'd become a teacher first, then a community coordinator, and finally had taken over the youth trade program at her grandfather's old shop after his death 5 years earlier, using the same building, teaching the same passion, exacting lessons about honest foundations to a new generation of kids who came from exactly the kind of hollow Nathaniel had come from himself. He told her carefully in pieces about the company, About the mine records sitting now in a folder on the passenger seat of his truck, about a fiancée whose face he had begun in the past 2 weeks to feel he barely recognized. He did not tell her about the ring still on his own hand in the form of a habit he hadn't broken, though he noticed her eyes go to it once briefly before she looked away. It was nearly 4 o'clock, the light outside beginning to slant gold through the shop's windows, when Ellie set her coffee down and said something that stopped the whole afternoon cold. "I wrote you a letter once," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. "A long time ago, about 12 years back, when your name first started showing up in the regional business papers, someone from town clipped one out and mailed it to my mother, if you can believe that. I wrote to you. I asked if we could talk again. I never heard anything back, so I figured you'd moved on with your life, and I told myself that was fair. You'd built something. I didn't want to be the person reaching backward into it." Nathaniel felt something drop through him, slow and total, like a floor giving way beneath a weight it had been holding for years without anyone realizing the joists had already cracked. "I never got a letter, Ellie. I swear to you I never got anything." "I believe you," she said, and there was something careful in the way she said it, something that told him she'd already been carrying this thought for longer than the last 5 minutes. "Because last week a woman I used to work with, she was in PR early in her career before she moved into corporate work, reached out to me on social media out of nowhere after seeing your name connected to some business news. She told me something that's been sitting with me ever since. She said that at the firm that used to manage your public image, back then there was a standard practice of screening incoming correspondence for anyone whose profile was rising. Anything flagged as inconsistent with the client's personal brand got held back, never forwarded. She specifically remembered a letter from West Virginia, signed Ellie Hartwell, flagged not to be passed along on the direct instruction of a junior associate handling your file at the time." Nathaniel sat completely still, the coffee shop noise around him receding into something distant and unimportant. "The associate's name was Vanessa Sinclair," Ellie said quietly. The words landed somewhere below where Priya's report had landed below, even the Ridgeline coal filing in a place Nathaniel had thought was too old and too settled to still be capable of this particular kind of ache. Vanessa had known about him, about all of it, about Ellie, about the life he'd left behind in this hollow long before the two of them had ever formally met at that fundraiser 18 months ago. She had not stumbled into his life by chance. She had, it seemed, been clearing a path toward it for years, quietly removing anything that might have given him a reason not to need her once she finally arrived. "I'm sorry," Ellie said, watching his face. "I debated whether to even tell you. It felt cruel after everything you're already carrying this week." "No," Nathaniel said, and found to his own surprise that his voice had gone rough. "No, I needed to know. I've spent 26 years wondering why I never heard from anyone back home once I started doing well. I told myself it was because people change, because success does something to old friendships. I never once considered that someone might have been standing at the door the whole time deciding what got through." They sat with that for a while, the coffee shop emptying out around them as the afternoon wore toward evening, and Nathaniel felt something shift inside his chest that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with a grief he hadn't let himself feel in over 2 decades, not for his father, on this time, but for the boy who had left this town at 21, believing he was building a bigger life, never once suspecting that someone somewhere down the road would spend years making sure that bigger life had no room left in it for anyone who had known him before the money. "I should get back," he said finally, though he made no move to stand. "I've got a lot to sort through, more than I realized this morning." "You know where to find me now," Ellie said, and there was nothing demanding in it, nothing that asked for more than what had already passed between them, only the quiet, steady offer of a door left open, the kind he hadn't been given by anyone in a very long time who wasn't asking for something in return. He drove back toward Charleston that night with the mine records on the passenger seat, and something new sitting beside them that he didn't yet have a name for, not quite hope, not quite grief, something closer to the particular ache of a man discovering that a part of himself he'd assumed was simply gone, had in fact only ever been waiting patiently on a porch step outside a woodshop for him to finally come back and check. He drove straight from the interstate to Walt's shop the following morning, still running on almost no sleep, the mine records and Priya's folder and everything Ellie had told him sitting together, now in a single case file in mind. Not separate wounds anymore, but one continuous wound, with a single source running underneath all of it. He needed the one person who had stood beside him through every version of his life, the boy from the same dirt road, the only man alive who could hold all of this without needing it, explained twice. Walt was already at the shop when Nathaniel pulled in, though it was barely past 7, and something in the set of his shoulders when he heard the truck door close told Nathaniel even before he'd crossed the gravel lot that his friend hadn't slept much either. "You look like hell," Walt said by way of greeting. "Feels about right," Nathaniel said. He laid it all out on the workbench between them: the mine safety citations, Priya's access logs, the LLC formation papers, the photographs from the hotel, and finally, quietly, the story Ellie had told him the day before about a letter that had never made it past a young associate's desk. Walt listened without interrupting, the way he always had, turning a chisel over and over in his hands without using it. A habit Nathaniel recognized from 35 years of watching Walt think through something he didn't like. When Nathaniel finished, Walt didn't say anything for a long moment. He set the chisel down on the bench with a small, deliberate click, and Nathaniel watched something move across his friend's face that he had seen only once or twice before in their entire lives. Not surprise, not anger on Nathaniel's behalf, but something closer to dread turned inward. "Walt," Nathaniel said slowly, "you already knew some of this, didn't you?" It wasn't quite a question, and Walt didn't answer it like one. He sat down heavily on the overturned crate. He always used elbows on his knees and stared at the sawdust-covered floor for long enough that Nathaniel felt the silence turn into its own kind of answer. 3 years ago, Walt said finally, his voice low and rough, the shop was about to go under. "You remember that year the recession hit small custom shops hard, nobody was commissioning furniture, and I'd already borrowed against the house once. No bank would touch a second loan for an outfit my size. I found a private lender instead. Fast money, ugly terms, but it kept the doors open." He paused, and when he looked up, his eyes were wet in a way Nathaniel had genuinely never seen in 35 years of friendship, not even at either of their fathers' funerals. "I didn't know then. I swear to you, on my daughter's life, I didn't know whose money it actually was. It came through a finance company with some generic name. I just needed it to stop bleeding cash. And you found out," Nathaniel said very quietly, already knowing where this was going, already feeling something cold settle into his chest ahead of the words. "2 months ago," Walt said, "a man showed up here. Nice suit, quiet voice, the kind of polite that's worse than yelling. Told me the loan had been quietly acquired, restructured he called it, and that the new terms required my full cooperation on a matter unrelated to the shop. Said if I told you anything at all about Vanessa, they'd call the note due in full, seize the shop, and make sure every supplier and every customer in 3 counties knew I'd defaulted before they were done." His voice cracked just slightly on the last few words. "My wife, my daughter Natty. I've got a business with my name on the door and a kid starting college in 2 years. I didn't know what else to do." Nathaniel stood very still, feeling something in his chest crack open along a line he hadn't known was there, not the clean, structural fracture he'd felt in the kitchen 2 weeks earlier, but something messier, something closer to the particular grief of discovering that a foundation he had trusted completely, without ever once thinking to inspect it, had been under strain for months without his knowledge. "You let me walk around thinking I was the only one who didn't know what was happening," Nathaniel said, and heard his own voice come out lower and harder than he intended. "I know," Walt said, not defending himself, not looking away either. "I know, and I hate what it did to you, having to go through all of this alone when you didn't have to. But I wasn't just sitting on my hands, Natty. I've been writing down every message, every threat, saving everything, trying to build enough of a record that when I finally brought it to you, you'd know I hadn't just been a coward, that I'd been trying to protect you the only way I knew how to. Without handing you a lie you'd never forgive me for telling on purpose." Nathaniel turned away from him for a moment, walking to the far end of the shop where a half-finished dining table sat under a drop cloth, running his hand along its edge without really seeing it, trying to steady something in himself that had gone entirely off its footing. He thought of Dominic Reyes's face in the parking lot of the hotel 2 weeks ago, unhurried, entitled, a man who had never once in his life had to wait for anything he wanted, and understood with a fresh, sickening clarity exactly how far that entitlement reached. Reyes had not simply tried to steal information from Nathaniel's company or humiliate him through Vanessa. He had reached into the life of the one person Nathaniel trusted completely and turned that trust into a weapon threatening a man's family, his livelihood, everything Walt had built with his own 2 hands over 15 patient years, all to buy a few more weeks of silence. "I'm not going to pretend this doesn't hurt," Nathaniel said finally, still facing away from him. "It does. You let me feel alone in this when I didn't have to." "I know," Walt said again, quieter this time. "But I understand it," Nathaniel said, and turned back around and found that whatever anger had flared in him a few minutes earlier had already begun involuntarily to give way to something else, the same clear-eyed recognition he'd felt sitting with Priya's folder, the same recognition, He'd felt hearing Ellie's story the day before the slow, unwelcome understanding that fear made people do things love alone never would have asked of them. I know what it is to have someone threaten to take away the only thing standing between your family and nothing. I lived that before I was old enough to shave. I'm not going to stand here and tell you I would have done any different at 22 with a wife and a kid depending on me. Walt looked up at him, something breaking open in his face. Relief, disbelief, grief. All at once, the particular expression of a man who had spent 2 months bracing for a conversation to end in something far worse than this. "You're not mad?" he asked, and his voice cracked fully this time. "I'm furious," Nathaniel said honestly. "But I'm not mad at you. Not really. I'm mad at the man who put you in a position where protecting your family and protecting me looked for 2 months like they had to be two different things." He crossed the shop floor and put a hand on Walt's shoulder the way he had 100 times before in 35 years over scraped knees and lost jobs and both their fathers' funerals. "We're going to fix this. All of it. Together. Same as we've always done." Walt didn't say anything for a moment. He just nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of one sawdust-covered hand, and Nathaniel stood there with him in the amber light of the shop, understanding with a clarity that felt almost physical that whatever came next, the reckoning, with Vanessa, the reckoning with Dominic Reyes, the reckoning, finally with a truth 26 years buried about his father, none of it was going to happen to Nathaniel alone. It never really had. He had simply spent too long believing that a man who built empires had to carry them by himself. He was beginning slowly, and against every old instinct he'd built his whole life around, to understand exactly how wrong that belief had always been. He drove home from Walt's shop that afternoon and called his personal attorney, before he'd even pulled out of the gravel lot, not the firm that handled Calloway Builders' corporate work, but the small, quiet practice he used for the parts of his life he preferred to keep separate from boardrooms entirely. He gave the attorney Walt's name, the finance company's registration, and a simple instruction: find out exactly what was owed and satisfy it in full immediately. Through the anonymous Small Business Relief Fund, Nathaniel had quietly established years earlier for situations he never talked about at galas. The original loan had been $92,000. With the finance company's punishing interest structure layered on top of it for 3 years, the balance had climbed to nearly $140,000. Nathaniel authorized the full payoff without hesitation, the way he'd authorize a rounding error on a project worth 100 times as much, and told his attorney one final thing: no documentation anywhere should ever connect his name to the transaction. Not now. Not later. Not even if Walt asked directly. He didn't tell Walt what he'd done. He went home that evening, sat through another dinner with Vanessa that felt more each night like watching a stage play he already knew the ending to, and said nothing to anyone about the wire transfer quietly clearing on a Monday morning. 3 days later, Walt called him that Tuesday afternoon, his voice doing something Nathaniel had never once heard it do in 35 years of friendship, cracking fully somewhere in the first sentence. "The bank just called," Walt said. "The loan. It's gone, Natty. Paid in full. All of it. I don't understand what happened." Nathaniel stood in his office looking out at the cranes over the Riverside site and let the silence sit for a moment before he answered. "You know what happened," he said quietly. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that Nathaniel could hear Walt's breathing go unsteady on the other end. "After everything I did," Walt said finally, his voice barely holding together. "After I let you walk around thinking you were alone in this for 2 months, you still did this for me. You protected your family the only way you knew how when someone put a knife to your whole life," Nathaniel said. "I don't know how to be angry at a man for that. I spent my childhood watching my mother do arithmetic against a woodpile because there wasn't enough to go around, Walt. I know exactly what fear does to a person who's got people depending on him. I just wish you'd trusted me enough to bring it to me sooner. That's the only part that still stings." There was a sound on the other end that Nathaniel recognized after a moment as Walt crying. Not quietly, not the composed private grief Nathaniel had seen in the woodshop days earlier, but something fuller, something that had clearly been held back for 2 months and had finally found somewhere safe enough to let go. Nathaniel had seen Walt cry exactly twice before in 35 years, once at his father's funeral, once at the birth of his daughter. He stood in his office and let his friend cry on the phone without interrupting, understanding that some debts once acknowledged didn't need any more words layered on top of them. "I will never let that happen again," Walt said finally, his voice steadying by degrees. "I don't care what anybody threatens me with. Never again, Natty. I mean that." "I know you do," Nathaniel said. "Come out to Riverside this weekend. I want to show you something." He drove back to West Virginia that same week, not for records this time, not for evidence, but because he had found himself somewhere in the middle of a board meeting 3 days earlier, thinking about Ellie's voice instead of the agenda in front of him, and had understood with the particular honesty a man allows himself only rarely that he needed to see her again for reasons that had nothing to do with courthouse files. They sat together on the front steps of the old woodshop as the light went long and gold across the gravel lot, the same steps where she used to wait for her grandfather with a paperback and a glass of sweet tea, and Nathaniel found himself telling her things he hadn't said out loud to anyone. Not Walt, not his lawyers, not even fully to himself in the quiet of his own office. He told her about the ambition that had eaten the years he should have spent writing her back. He told her he understood now with a clarity that had taken him 26 years and one broken engagement to arrive at, that he had spent his whole adult life building things to prove he was no longer the boy counting logs against a hard winter, and that somewhere in all that building he had genuinely believed a person had to be fully finished, fully arrived before they were allowed to come home to something real. "I thought love needed to wait until I'd earned it," he said, watching the light fade over the ridgeline in the distance, the same ridgeline that had swallowed his father 26 years earlier, and had somehow impossibly also raised the woman sitting beside him. "I thought I had to be someone worth coming back for before I let myself come back." Ellie was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup slowly in her hands. "The foundation was never the money, Nate," she said finally. "It was never the buildings or the company or any of it. The real foundation is whatever's still standing after everything else gets stripped away, and from where I'm sitting, that's a man who drove 2 hours out of his way to sit on a set of porch steps and finally say the thing he should have said 26 years ago." She reached over and took his hand, the gesture simple and unhurried, nothing like the careful, photographed gestures he'd grown used to over 18 months with Vanessa. "You don't have to earn coming home, Nate. You just have to be honest when you finally do." Something in his chest, some old tightly wound thing he had carried since he was 12 years old, counting firewood in the dark, loosened by a degree he hadn't felt in decades. Not fully healed, not yet, but no longer entirely alone in the dark either. He drove back to Charleston that night with the windows down, the mountain air giving way slowly to the thicker, salted air of the coast, and thought about the two men he had become over the past 3 weeks, the one who had learned with cold, methodical patience to build an airtight case against the two people who had betrayed him, and the one who had learned almost by accident, sitting on a set of porch steps in the town he'd left behind, that some of what he'd lost hadn't actually been lost at all. It had simply been waiting. Walt came out to the Riverside site that weekend as promised, and Nathaniel walked him through the framing of the community center, the two of them talking shop, the way they'd been talking shop since they were boys, no mention necessary, of loans or debts, or the 2 months Walt had spent carrying a thread alone. Somewhere in the middle of that walk, standing under the half-finished roof trusses with sawdust drifting in the afternoon light, Walt turned to him and said simply, "Thank you, Natty, for all of it, not just the money." "You don't have to thank me," Nathaniel said. "I do though," Walt said, "because I've watched a lot of men get rich in my life, and every single one of them got smaller while it happened. You're the only one I know who got bigger." Nathaniel didn't have an answer for that, not right away. He stood beside his oldest friend under the bones of a building that would within the year house families who had nowhere else affordable left to go in a city that had priced most of them out, and thought about foundations, the ones he built, out of steel and concrete, and the far more fragile, far more essential ones. He was only now at 48 years old, finally learning how to properly inspect. There was still a reckoning coming. He could feel it approaching the way he'd once felt weather before it arrived. Vanessa, Dominic, the truth about his father, all of it converging now toward a single night he had already begun quietly and carefully to plan. But for the first time in 3 weeks, walking beside Walt under a roof they were building together, Nathaniel felt something that had nothing to do with evidence or timing or careful, controlled fury. He felt for the first time in a very long time that he was not standing alone. The date for the public unveiling of Riverside Commons had been set for months long before any of this began. A ceremony marking the topping out of the community center where Nathaniel and Walt had stood together beneath the roof, trusses just days earlier, timed to coincide with the final in-year roadshow push for the initial public offering. 300 guests, the full board, every major investor in the deal, press from 2 coastal business journals, and Nathaniel's team confirmed after a few careful calls a courtesy invitation already extended months in advance to Meridian Coastal Holdings, as was customary between competitors in a market small enough that everyone still had to sit in the same rooms occasionally. Nathaniel did not change the guest list. He did not move the date. Instead, over the 2 weeks that followed his conversation with Walt beneath the trusses, he began quietly building something else entirely underneath the evening everyone else believed they were attending. He met with Priya twice more in the same out-of-the-way coffee shop, going over the final compilation of evidence, the access logs, the LLC formation papers, the photographs from Vendu range, all of it organized now into a binder. His personal attorney had reviewed line by line to make certain nothing in it could be challenged as improperly obtained. "It's clean," his attorney told him at their final review, sliding the binder back across the desk. "Every piece of this would hold up in a courtroom, let alone a ballroom." He called his labor attorney next, a woman named Deborah Ashworth, who had spent the better part of her career representing families in wrongful death claims against extraction companies before retiring into a smaller advisory practice, and asked her plainly what it would take to reopen a 26-year-old federal mine safety case with new corroborating evidence. She listened to everything he had, the citations, the inspector's notes, the archived newspaper article, and told him carefully that while she couldn't promise criminal exposure, after so much time had passed, a properly documented public disclosure, paired with the right regulatory referral, could absolutely reopen the door. The original investigation had closed too quickly. "The Department of Labor doesn't love reopening old wounds," she said, "but they love it a lot more than they love the appearance of having buried one." There was one more call Nathaniel needed to make, and he put it off for 3 days before he finally picked up the phone. The retired federal mine safety inspector, who had gone on record 26 years earlier, the man quoted by name in the archived article, was 81 years old now, and living in a small house 2 counties from Nathaniel's childhood home. Nathaniel drove out to meet him in person rather than call, understanding from his own upbringing that some conversations owed a man the courtesy of a face across the table instead of a voice down a wire. The old inspector, whose name was Harlan Voss, listened to Nathaniel's introduction, his father's name, the mine, the timeline for less than a minute before his eyes went wet, and he said something Nathaniel would carry with him for the rest of his life. "I've been waiting 26 years for somebody with enough standing in this world to finally make people listen to what I already knew." He agreed without hesitation to speak publicly again on record, on camera, if it came to that, for the first time since the original investigation had quietly closed around him. Nathaniel drove home from that meeting with something settling into place inside him that felt, for the first time since this entire ordeal began 3 weeks earlier, less like anger and more like purpose, the particular focused calm of a man who understands exactly what he intends to build and has finally assembled every material he needs to build it. He brought Walt in fully over the following week, walking him through the entire architecture of the plan the way he'd once walked him through a set of blueprints back when Walt had helped frame Nathaniel's very first small development. Walt would stand near the front of the room that night, close enough to step forward if needed, close enough that Nathaniel would be able to find his face in the crowd at the exact moment it mattered most. Margaret Alston, his executive assistant of 15 years, was brought in next. The one person inside the company Nathaniel trusted with the full picture, and the woman who, upon hearing the entire story laid out across his desk, sat back in her chair for a long moment and said only, "Mr. Calloway, I've worked for you for 15 years. I've never once seen you act out of anger without thinking it all the way through first. I don't expect that to change tonight, whatever happens." He called Ellie the evening before the event, sitting alone in his home office, with the lights low, the same room where all of this had truly begun 3 weeks earlier. He told her everything: the plan, the binder, Harlan Voss, the reopened investigation that might finally give his father's name back the dignity a 2-sentence letter had stolen from it 26 years before. "Whatever happens tomorrow night," Ellie said, her voice steady and warm across the distance between them, "you are not walking into that room alone. Not anymore. I don't care how many miles are between us right now, you carry that with you." He sat with the phone against his ear for a long moment after she said it, looking out the window at the dark water beyond the marsh grass, and thought about how strange it was that the 2 things holding him steady on the eve of the hardest night of his adult life were not the wealth he'd spent 26 years accumulating, not the buildings with his name quietly engraved on their cornerstones, but a woman he'd left behind at 21, and a friend who had known him since before either of them owned a pair of shoes without holes in them. Vanessa, for her part, noticed nothing. She spent that final week exactly as she had spent the weeks before it, coordinating the event's final logistics with genuine tireless enthusiasm, walking Nathaniel through seating charts and lighting cues with the easy confidence of a woman who believed completely that she had already won whatever game she thought she was playing. She kissed him goodnight the evening before the gala, and told him, her hand resting against his chest, that she couldn't wait to see 3 years of his work finally come together in front of everyone who mattered. "Neither can I," Nathaniel said, and it was in its own way the most honest thing he had said to her in 3 weeks. He lay awake long after she'd fallen asleep, running through the sequence of the evening, in his mind one final time, the way he used to walk a construction site the night before a major inspection, checking every load point, every connection, every place. A plan might fail under pressure. It hadn't been tested against yet. He thought of his father, of Harlan Voss's wet eyes across a kitchen table 2 counties away, of Walt's voice cracking on the phone over a debt quietly erased, Veli's steady certainty that he would not be walking into tomorrow night alone. He thought, too, of the 12-year-old boy who had once lain awake in a cold house counting logs against a hard winter, promising himself that no one would ever again get to decide what he was. That boy had spent 36 years building an empire to make that promise true. Tomorrow night, Nathaniel understood, lying in the dark beside a woman who had no idea what was coming. He would finally find out whether all of it, the buildings, the fortune, the careful, patient construction of an entire life, had been strong enough after all to hold the weight of the truth he was about to set down on top of it. He closed his eyes sometime after 2 in the morning, and for the first time in 3 weeks he slept. The tent went up along the riverbank 2 days before the event, a great pale structure lit from within by the time the sun went down. String lights strung between the newly framed community center's roof trusses, so that the half-finished building itself became part of the evenings, staging steel and timber and glass rising up out of ground. Nathaniel had walked with his own boots, dressed now in warm light, for 300 people who had no idea what they were actually about to witness. He arrived early, before the caterers had finished setting the tables, and stood alone for a few minutes at the edge of the site, looking out at the dark water, feeling the particular focused stillness that had settled into him sometime after 2 in the morning the night before and hadn't left. Since not calm exactly, but something adjacent to it. The steadiness of a man who has checked every connection point in a structure and is finally ready to see whether it holds. Walt arrived not long after, dressed in a suit Nathaniel had rarely seen him wear, and found him at the edge of the tent. Neither of them said much. There wasn't much left to say that the last 3 weeks hadn't already said between them. Walt simply put a hand on his shoulder, the same gesture Nathaniel had given him in the woodshop weeks earlier, and the two of them stood together for a moment, watching the guests begin to arrive. Headlights sweeping slowly up the gravel drive in the deepening blue evening. Dominic Reyes arrived 15 minutes late, exactly as Nathaniel had expected. A man who had never once in his life walked into a room on anyone's schedule but his own, in a dark blue suit, shaking hands with the easy, practiced confidence of someone who believed himself tonight to be watching the final act of a plan he'd spent months assembling. He greeted Nathaniel warmly at the entrance, gripping his hand a beat too long, and said something about how proud Wade Calloway would have been to see how far his son had come. Nathaniel shook his hand and said nothing about the fact that he now knew with documentary certainty exactly what role Dominic Reyes's own name had played in ensuring Wade Calloway never got the chance to see any of it. Vanessa stood beside Nathaniel on the small raised platform at the center of the tent when the evening's remarks began, radiant in pale blue, her hand resting lightly against his arm, exactly where the photographers wanted it. She had spent the last hour moving through the crowd with genuine warmth, thanking board members, laughing at the right moments, entirely certain that tonight belonged to her as much as to him. Nathaniel began the way he'd planned, talking about Riverside Commons, about the working families it was built for, about a vision he had carried since he was young enough to understand exactly what it meant to grow up without enough. The room settled into the comfortable rhythm of a speech it expected to end predictably, in applause and champagne. Then he stopped. "Before I talk any further about the buildings," he said, his voice carrying steady and clear across the tent, "I want to talk about foundations. Because tonight I learned that the foundation under my own life, both the one I've been building for the past 18 months and one that was laid 26 years ago and never properly examined, has been compromised by the same hand." The room went quiet in the particular way. A large crowd goes quiet all at once, 300 conversations collapsing into a single held breath. He turned to Vanessa first. He laid it out plainly, without raising his voice, the way he'd learned to deliver bad structural news to a client: clean, factual, undeniable. The unauthorized access to the confidential IPO valuation materials. The Tuesday afternoon pattern 4 weeks running. The anonymized data trail Priya had followed to a shell company called Coastal Bridge Advisors, registered 4 months earlier, its sole listed officer sitting in this very room. He watched Vanessa's face move through disbelief, and then something colder, calculating, searching the crowd for an exit that didn't exist. Then he turned to Dominic. "But this isn't the first time my family has paid for your ambition," Nathaniel said, and felt his own voice for the first time all evening shake slightly with something that had nothing to do with performance. 26 years ago, my father Wade Calloway died in the collapse of Ridgeline No. 9, a mine owned by a company you chaired at 28 years old. After that company ignored 3 separate safety warnings in the 6 months before the collapse, because addressing them would have cost money right before a funding round. The murmur that moved through the crowd this time was louder, sharper edged with genuine shock. Nathaniel gave a small signal toward the side of the tent, and Harlan Voss stepped forward into the light, 81 years old, steady on his feet, his voice carrying clearly as he confirmed on record in front of 2 business journalists and a small crew from a regional news affiliate. Nathaniel's team had quietly invited that afternoon, everything he had told federal investigators 26 years earlier, and had never been given the chance to say loudly enough for it to matter. Dominic Reyes stood frozen near the front of the crowd, his face draining of color in a way Nathaniel had never once in over 2 decades of knowing the man seen it do. Nathaniel let the silence hold for a moment before he turned back to Vanessa one last time, and when he spoke again, his voice had softened, not gentler exactly but quieter, the particular quiet of a man setting down something heavy with great care rather than throwing it. "And you," he said, "intercepted a letter 12 years ago from a woman I once loved, to make certain I had no one left to come home to but you. You didn't just take information from my company. You took a piece of my life I was owed the chance to choose for myself." He reached up and removed the engagement ring from where it sat still absurdly, in the small velvet box on the table beside him. She had taken it off earlier that evening to have it cleaned. She'd said, though he understood, now she had, simply wanted one more day of wearing it before whatever she and Dominic had planned came due. He set it down on the white tablecloth gently, the way a man sets down a contract he no longer intends to honor. "We're done," he said. 2 words and nothing more. He stepped down from the platform and walked directly toward the front row where Walt stood, waiting, and beyond him in the second row, a face Nathaniel had not expected, but felt his chest loosen at the sight of Anyway Ellie, who had dripped down from West Virginia that morning, without telling him, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd in a simple gray dress, having promised him 3 weeks earlier that he would not walk into this room alone, and having apparently meant it in the most literal sense possible. He crossed the tent toward the 2 of them without once looking back at the platform at Vanessa, standing frozen beside an empty microphone at Dominic Reyes, surrounded now by board members whose faces had gone hard and unreadable in exactly the way Nathaniel had spent 3 weeks hoping they would. Behind him he could hear the tent erupting into overlapping conversation phones being raised, a low, continuous murmur of shock rolling outward through 300 people like weather finally breaking after a long, humid buildup. Walt gripped his shoulder as he reached the front row, saying nothing, needing to say nothing. Ellie took his hand a moment later, her fingers steady around his, and Nathaniel stood there between the 2 people who had carried him through the last 3 weeks, without ever once asking what it would cost them to do it, and felt for the first time since a soup ladle had gone still in his hand in his own kitchen that the ground beneath him had finally fully stopped shaking. Behind them, the tent lights kept burning against the dark water, and the half-finished community center stood lit up in the background of it all, steel and timber rising toward a roof that wasn't finished yet, a structure still very much under construction exactly the way Nathaniel understood, standing there with Walt on one side and Ellie on the other, that his own life had also become. The story broke before Nathaniel even made it back to his truck that night. By the time he woke the next morning after the first full stretch of unbroken sleep he'd had in nearly a month, his phone held 41 missed notifications, and the regional business paper had already run a headline online that used the words "shocking allegations" and reopened federal inquiry in the same sentence. The Securities and Exchange Commission opened a preliminary review of Meridian Coastal Holdings within the week, prompted by an anonymous but thoroughly documented complaint that Nathaniel's attorneys had filed the morning after the gala, laying out the shell company, the access logs, and the pattern of unauthorized data transfers in language precise enough that no regulator could reasonably set it aside. Meridian's stock dropped sharply within 48 hours of the first news reports, investors reading the situation exactly the way Nathaniel had hoped they would, not as a rival's misfortune, but as a warning sign about the character of the man running the company. Dominic Reyes was removed as chairman by his own board 11 days later, in a vote Nathaniel heard about secondhand from a mutual acquaintance who described the meeting as brutal and mercifully short. 3 months after that, Federal investigators reopening the Ridgeline No. 9 case at the joint urging of the Department of Labor's regional office, and a written statement Harlan Voss had now formally submitted alongside his original 26-year-old field notes, referred the matter for possible criminal charges related to the concealment of known safety violations. Nathaniel did not celebrate when he heard the news. He drove out that same afternoon to visit his father's grave for the first time in nearly a decade, and sat there a long while in the quiet telling Wade Calloway in a voice too low for anyone else to hear that it had taken 26 years, but somebody had finally been made to answer for it. Vanessa called him 19 times in the 3 days after the gala. He answered none of them. His attorney sent a formal letter within the week demanding the return of funds improperly withdrawn from their shared household account during the months she'd been meeting Dominic Reyes, a modest sum by Nathaniel's standards, $23,000, but a figure he wanted, documented and returned on principle rather than out of any real financial concern. She wired the full amount back without a word of explanation 2 weeks later, and Nathaniel understood reading the confirmation on his phone that he had gotten from her everything he was ever going to get, not remorse, not an accounting, just a quiet transactional, closing out the kind you'd give any business relationship that had simply run its course. He moved out of the house on the peninsula within the month into a smaller place downtown he'd bought years earlier as an investment property and never bothered to sell, and found somewhat to his own surprise that he didn't miss the marble countertops or the thin, treacherous wall between the kitchen and the sitting room even once. Walt and Nathaniel signed a formal partnership agreement 6 weeks after the gala, Walt's shop becoming the exclusive furniture and millwork supplier for every unit at Riverside Commons. A contract large enough that Walt hired 4 additional craftsmen within the first month just to keep pace with it. Nathaniel drove out to the shop the day the first shipment went out and found Walt standing at the loading dock watching the truck pull away, grinning in a way Nathaniel hadn't seen on his friend's face in years. Not the careful, guarded smile of a man carrying a secret, but something open and unburdened. The smile of a man who had finally set something down he'd been carrying too long. "You didn't have to give me all this business, you know," Walt said, watching the truck disappear down the road. "The partnership would have been plenty." "I know," Nathaniel said. "I wanted to anyway." Margaret Alston, sorting through the quarter's financial reports with Nathaniel one afternoon a few weeks later, set her folder down and looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I think what makes you different isn't the money you've made. It's what you did with the fear a man like Dominic Reyes tried to use against your best friend. You didn't punish him for being afraid. You just quietly made sure he never had to be afraid again." She picked her folder back up before he could answer the closest thing to an emotional moment either of them typically allowed themselves during business hours, and moved on to the next line item as though she hadn't said anything at all. The story lingered in the regional press for a few weeks longer than Nathaniel expected. Then, as these things always eventually did, began to fade beneath newer headlines. He gave exactly one interview about the whole affair to a local paper rather than a national outlet, and used most of it to talk not about Vanessa or Dominic, but about his father, about a man who had gone into a mine 6 days a week for 11 years to keep a roof over his family's heads, and had never lived to see a single one of the buildings his son would eventually put up in his memory. He established the fund that same month quietly, the way he did most of the things that actually mattered to him. A scholarship and trade training endowment in his father's name, seeded with a portion of the proceeds from now successful initial public offering aimed specifically at kids growing up in the same hollows and small towns. Nathaniel himself had grown up in kids who needed someone to hand them a second nail without comment the way Earl Whitfield once had for him. He called Ellie the evening the fund's paperwork was finalized, sitting in his new, smaller apartment with a glass of water instead of wine, feeling for the first time in longer than he could remember something close to settled. "I want to build it around your grandfather's shop," he told her. "Not replace it. Grow it. A real trade school with your program at the center of it fully funded permanently. I want kids from that hollow to have what I almost never got." There was a long pause on the line, and when Ellie finally spoke, her voice had gone thick in a way that told him even 300 miles apart that she was crying. "Nate," she said, "that's the most beautiful thing anyone's ever offered me." "It's not really for you," he said gently. "It's for him, and for every kid who's ever gone to bed hungry in that hollow thinking nobody was ever coming back for them. It's for you too," Ellie said, "whether you'll admit that part or not." He didn't argue with her. He sat there in the quiet of his new apartment phone against his ear, and let himself for the first time in 26 years believe that might actually be true. The reckoning was by any measure that mattered in his old world complete. Dominic Reyes disgraced and facing charges. Vanessa gone from his life entirely. The company stronger and more trusted than it had been before any of it began. But sitting there that evening, Nathaniel understood that the real accounting hadn't happened in a boardroom or a courtroom at all. It had happened on a set of porch steps in West Virginia, and in a woodshop full of sawdust and old debts finally settled. And in the particular unglamorous work of learning at 48 years old, that the strongest thing he had ever built wasn't a company. It was the handful of people who had refused to let him carry any of it alone. The trade school broke ground the following spring on a stretch of land just down the road from Earl Whitfield's old shop, close enough that the new building's front windows looked out over the same ridgeline Nathaniel had grown. Up beneath, he stood at the edge of the site on the morning construction, began watching an excavator break ground on soil. He had once walked barefoot as a boy, too poor for shoes in summer, and felt something settle inside him that no amount of money had ever quite managed to settle before. Walt drove up from Charleston for the groundbreaking, his truck loaded with a set of hand tools he insisted on donating personally, the same kind of chisels and planes Earl had once used, purchased new but broken in himself over several weekends beforehand, so they wouldn't feel, he said, like something out of a catalog. Kids ought to learn on tools that already know how to work, he told Nathaniel, setting the case down carefully on a folding table near the site office. Not something still stiff out of the box. Ellie stood beside them both that morning, the wind pulling loose strands of hair across her face, watching the machinery move earth on ground she had known her entire life. She had agreed 3 months earlier to serve as the school's founding director, and had spent the winter designing a curriculum that braided together everything her grandfather had once taught a hungry, hammer-shy 16-year-old on unpaid weekends: carpentry, plumbing, electrical work. The honest trades that had once been the only ladder available to boys like Nathaniel Calloway offered now permanently and without cost to the next generation of kids growing up in the same hollows. The building rose over the following year, steel and timber, going up under Nathaniel's own occasional supervision on weekends. He carved out specifically for it, refusing every offer from his executive team to send a project manager in his place. Some things he had learned needed his own 2 hands on them, not because the company couldn't handle it without him, but because he needed for his own sake. To still know what it felt like to build something with sawdust on his boots, and no cameras watching. He and Ellie married the following autumn, a small ceremony at the shop itself rather than any of the venues his wealth could easily have afforded. Folding chairs set out among the wood shavings, Walt standing beside him as best man Margaret, Alston crying openly in the second row in a way that surprised everyone who had only ever known her composed and unshakable behind a desk. Nathaniel stood at the front of that small, sawdust-scented room and thought, watching Ellie walk toward him down an aisle. Her own grandfather had once swept clean 1,000 times, that he had spent 26 years believing he needed to finish building his life before he was allowed to come home to it. He understood now, watching her come closer, that home had never required finishing. It had only ever required honesty. A year after the wedding, on a bright afternoon with the trade school's first graduating class gathered on the lawn in front of the building, 22 teenagers in borrowed dress shirts, families crowding the folding chairs. Modest reception table of lemonade and sheet cake, set up under a tent far smaller and far less polished than the one at Riverside Commons had been. Nathaniel stood at a small podium and gave the shortest speech he had ever given in his professional life. When I was your age, he told them, I went to bed some nights without enough to eat in a house where the wind came through the walls, whether we wanted it to or not. I used to lie there and do arithmetic that no kid should have to do: how many logs were left, how many nights of winter remained. I promised myself in the dark that no one would ever again get to decide what I was capable of becoming. He paused, looking out over the rows of young faces. Some of them, he knew, doing that exact same arithmetic in their own homes tonight. I want you to hear this clearly: where you start does not decide where you end up. But you don't get there alone, and you don't get there by pretending you don't need anybody. I nearly lost everything that actually mattered because I spent too many years believing a man had to carry his whole life by himself to prove he'd earned it. I was wrong. The strongest thing I ever built wasn't a company. It was the handful of people who refused to let me carry any of it alone, and one day I hope every one of you sitting here becomes that person for somebody else. The applause that followed was smaller and less polished than anything Riverside Commons had ever produced, and it meant more to him than every ovation he'd received in a ballroom in his entire adult life. There is a lesson in Nathaniel Calloway's story that reaches far beyond any boardroom or courthouse, and it is worth sitting with long after the details of any one betrayal have faded. Wealth, status, and success can build astonishing things: towers, companies, reputations that echo across an entire region, but none of it can substitute for the quieter, harder work of choosing honest people to stand beside you and of being honest enough yourself to let them. Nathaniel nearly lost himself twice over, once to a woman who saw him as a line item to be managed, and once to his own old belief that asking for help was a kind of weakness he could never afford to show. What finally saved him wasn't cleverness or money. It was his willingness at 48 years old to finally set down the exhausting old habit of carrying everything alone to forgive a frightened friend instead of punishing him. To walk back through a door he'd left closed for 26 years instead of assuming it was too late, and to seek the truth about his father, not for revenge, but so that a debt of dignity 26 years overdue could finally be paid in full. If there is one thing worth carrying out of this story into your own life, let it be this. The people who stand by you honestly, even when honesty costs them something, are the real foundation beneath everything else you will ever build. Protect that foundation before you protect anything else. Inspect it often, and when someone you love is silent out of fear rather than malice, remember that compassion offered patiently will almost always rebuild more than anger ever could. Thank you so much for staying with Nathaniel's story all the way to its final page. If this journey moved you even a little, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss what's coming next. There is another story waiting for you very soon, just as emotional, just as full of heart, and I promise you, just as unforgettable. Until then, take good care of yourselves and the people who show up for you honestly. I'll see you in the next story.